Algeria, 1957. Two French paratroopers are falling through the sky, strapped to cargo pallets, and underneath each man, cushioned by hay bales, is a Vespa scooter, not a Jeep, not a motorcycle built for war. A civilian Italian scooter, the kind tourists rode through Rome, modified with a reinforced frame and fitted with a 75mm anti-tank cannon firing straight through a hole cut in the front leg shield. The two scooters land. The paratroopers unstrap them, mount up, and ride toward the fight, one carrying the gun, the other carrying the ammunition. Within minutes, they can destroy a fortified bunker or punch through 100mm of armor plate. The French military called it the Troops Aéroportée scooter. Everyone else called it the Bazooka Vespa, and the story of why France strapped an anti-tank weapon to a moped is a story about what happens when a defeated army refuses to make the same mistake twice. Before this video ends, you will understand why France, humiliated by German tanks in 1940, built one of the strangest anti-armor weapons of the entire Cold War, why a $500 scooter ended up doing a job that should have required a vehicle 50 times more expensive, and why the design choice that made the Vespa work was not the gun. It was the way the gun got rid of its own recoil. But here is the detail that should already be sitting with you. French soldiers could disassemble the cannon's firing mechanism in under 2 minutes with nothing but basic tools. The entire weapon system was built around a single idea. Speed has to beat power because power alone had already failed France once. To understand why the Vespa 150 tap exists, you need to go back to May 1940. German armored divisions broke through French defenses at Sedan in days, executing a form of mechanized warfare French military planners had not seriously prepared to counter its scale. The fall of France happened with terrifying speed, and the lesson the French military drew from that catastrophe was specific. Future warfare would demand mobility above almost everything else. A heavy, slow anti-tank gun towed by trucks was a relic of the war they had just lost. What France needed in the radically different colonial conflicts that followed, Indochina and increasingly Algeria, was something that could be dropped from an aircraft, assembled in minutes, and moving toward the fight before the enemy even knew paratroopers had landed. The answer, commissioned in the mid-1950s, started with an ordinary civilian Vespa scooter, the same model riding through the streets of Paris and Rome at the time. A CMA, the French company licensed to build Vespas domestically, reinforced the frame, shortened the gear ratios to handle additional weight, and fitted 8-inch tires rated for rough terrain. Then came the modification that turned a moped into a weapon, a 75mm M20 recoilless rifle, American surplus left over from Korea, mounted through a hole cut directly into the scooter's front leg shield. The M20 fired anti-tank, high explosive, and smoke rounds, with a heat warhead capable of punching through 100mm of armor at up to 400 meters. The entire weapon system, scooter included, weighed 115 kilograms and cost the French military roughly $500. At a time when a single tank cost 50 times more. The engineering trick that made this possible was not the gun itself. It was how the gun handled recoil. A standard 75mm cannon firing a shell that size would have torn the scooter apart on the first shot. The backward force alone would have shattered the frame. The M20 recoilless rifle solved that problem by venting roughly 90% of the propellant gas backward through an open breech and an annular nozzle the moment the round fired. Instead of slamming backward into the gun mount, the explosive force escaped harmlessly out the rear in a violent backblast, one requiring a clear zone of at least 15 meters behind the weapon, but eliminating the need for the heavy recoil-absorbing mechanisms every conventional cannon required. That single engineering decision is the entire reason a 90-kilogram scooter could fire a 75mm anti-tank round without disintegrating. The tactical doctrine built around the Vespa tap was precise and unusual. Two scooters were parachute dropped together as a pair, each rigged to a cargo pallet and cushioned by hay bales to absorb the landing shock. dropped from aircraft like the Fairchild C-119 flying boxcar. One scooter carried the recoilless rifle itself. The second carried 6 rounds of ammunition, spare fuel, and a folding tripod. The gun was never actually designed to fire from the scooter's own frame. The absence of any proper sighting system made that impractical for accurate fire. Standard procedure called for paratroopers to ride to a firing position, dismount, set the M20 up on a Browning M 1917 machine gun tripod also carried by the scooter, and engage from solid ground. In genuine emergencies, the rifle could be fired directly from the moving scooter, a tactic soldiers described as effective, mostly at close range and mostly out of desperation. Roughly 600 to 800 Vespa, 150 TAPs were built between 1956 and 1959, the vast majority seeing service in the Algerian War rather than the earlier conflict in Indochina, which had already ended by the time the design entered production. In Algeria, the M20's 75mm heat warhead proved most effective, not against the modern Soviet armor the weapon had originally been designed to threaten, but against the fortified bunkers and lightly armored vehicles used by the Algerian National Liberation Army. French paratroopers and Foreign Legion units used the scooter's compact size to navigate terrain that would have stopped a jeep, getting an anti-tank weapon into positions no conventional vehicle could reach. The scooters proved unexpectedly rugged. Soldiers reported they could travel over 100 miles on a single tank of fuel and held up better than anyone expected against the punishing terrain of the Algerian interior. The Vespa TAP's combat record reveals something that almost never gets acknowledged about so-called joke weapons in military history. Most of them were never actually jokes to the people who built them. By the mid-1950s, the M20 recoilless rifle was already aging against the newest generation of Soviet tanks. It could threaten older T-54s, but offered little against more modern armor entering service elsewhere. France was not unaware of this. The weapon was never intended as the decisive answer to a Soviet tank invasion of Western Europe. It was a cheap, mobile, air-droppable solution to the specific colonial warfare France was actually fighting in the 1950s, and in that narrower, more honest mission, it performed precisely as designed. Production ended in 1959, and the Vespa 150 TAP's service life was short by military standards. Fewer than a decade from concept to retirement. Better dedicated anti-tank weapons, more powerful and more accurately sighted, eventually rendered the scooter-mounted system obsolete, even for its narrow colonial mission. Most of the roughly 600 to 800 built were lost or scrapped during their operational service, and surviving examples are now exceptionally rare. In 2020, a 1956 first-year model sold at an Italian dealership for over $47,000, nearly 100 times its original 1950s price tag. A reminder that the strangest weapons often become the most coveted relics, precisely because almost none of them survived to be collected. Here is what the Vespa TAP actually proves. France, humiliated by the speed and mobility of German armor in 1940, spent the following decade obsessed with a single principle. A weapon that arrives fast and disappears fast beats a weapon that arrives slow, no matter how powerful it is. That principle, applied with total commitment, produced something that looked absurd sitting on a parade ground and performed exactly as intended in the terrain it was actually built for. The M20's vented backblast made the impossible structurally possible. The parachute rigging made the impractical logistically routine, and 600 to 800 Italian civilian scooters, repainted olive drab and fitted with American war surplus cannons, did a job in the Algerian mountains that France's much larger, much more expensive conventional forces could not do as quickly or as cheaply. Here is where we are. A scooter designed for the streets of Rome, modified by a French motor company, armed with a Korean war surplus American cannon, dropped from cargo aircraft into the Algerian war on hay bales and cargo pallets, did real damage to real fortifications using an engineering trick, vented recoil, that no one had successfully scaled down to something this small before. It was never going to stop a Soviet tank invasion of Europe, and France never needed it to. It needed something cheap, fast, and airdroppable for the war it was actually fighting. And for 3 years, in the late 1950s, a 246-pound scooter with a cannon through its leg shield did exactly that. Subscribe. Next week, we cover the weapon France built to actually answer Soviet tanks, and why it took them another 15 years to get serious about that problem.